In 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made the first powered, heavier-than-air flight. Only 11 years later, with the outbreak of World War I, the world would see this new technology being used to aid in the greatest struggle the world had ever seen. Modern artillery plays such an important part in a defensive action that too much stress cannot be laid on the work of the core machines. Counter-battery without air observation is in most cases of little value. If this object can be attained, it will be a far more effectual help to the infantry and artillery, though invisible to them, than any amount of low-flying or bombing against the enemy frontline troops. At the outbreak of the war in 1914, the only form of aerial reconnaissance in use was spotters and dirigibles with primitive handheld cameras. Balloons had been in use since the American Civil War and would continue to prove useful throughout the duration of World War I. Later in the war, with the rise of armed heavier-than-air aircrafts, use of balloons for reconnaissance became too dangerous. Instead, these dirigibles were employed in strategic bombing campaigns, where they could drop payloads from above the highest operating altitudes of airplanes at the time. Many in the high command on both sides of the conflict were hesitant to accept the use of airplanes in any kind of war-going capacity, seeing flying as nothing more than a sport. Once these planes proved their usefulness in spotting enemy movements during the first, mobile months of the war, these staunch traditionalists lightened up to the idea of using these new machines for aerial reconnaissance. Initial reconnaissance flights were flown by inexperienced pilots in cheaply constructed aircrafts with only their naked eyes to gather information. I wandered around western Belgium for some time, and then seeing a large town over which the Belgian flag seemed to be flying, I landed on the parade ground. Leaving an hour later, I lost myself again very quickly. Pilots were spending most of their time in the air just trying to figure out where they were. It was clear that a second crewman, a spotter, was needed. On top of having a spotter, a new invention was about to be put into use, one that would reshape the way war was viewed and how it was fought. The first aerial camera was developed prior to the outbreak of the war under strict secrecy in the French Aeronautical Research Center at Chalais-Moudon. This technology received little interest at the time, but once the war broke out, the French immediately began organizing squadrons of reconnaissance aircraft rigged with these new aerial cameras. The British and Germans weren't far behind. Germany had a proud tradition of camera making and were at the forefront of aviation technology all throughout the war. Their capabilities in aerial reconnaissance were never as great as the Allies, however, as they didn't focus as much of their resources towards the effort. With this new perspective on the conflict, generals could plan attacks with an unprecedented amount of intelligence. No longer was the other side of the hill a mystery. It could be observed, it could be measured, and it could be attacked. Interplane combat started first with pilots taking pot shots at each other with their service revolvers as they passed in the air. It then evolved into mounting machine guns on planes for spotters to use if they should come across enemy aircraft. Finally, with the invention of the interrupter gear, which allowed pilots to fire forward-facing weapons without shredding their propeller, any plane was capable of engaging enemy aircraft. By 1916, the airspace of the front lines was so crowded with aircraft from either side that the days of a single plane foraying into enemy airspace to capture reconnaissance photographs was over. Most reconnaissance flights started being flown in squadrons. Usually they would consist of one reconnaissance aircraft with several fighter aircraft for protection. As deadly as enemy aircraft could be, most planes that were shot down by ground fire. And deadly as either of those could be, nearly half of the pilot deaths in the first year of the war were simply from training accidents. At the time, the blame for most accidental deaths were put on pilot error. It's likely that many of those deaths were also the result of faulty early aircraft design. Photographic interpretation was a key skill in the aerial reconnaissance process. There were special workers who developed and analyzed the images captured by aerial cameras. Sometimes, if rushed, they could skip developing the photograph and just use the film negatives. Once enemy trenches, fortifications, or artillery pieces were identified in these images, the information was relayed to whoever needed it. Usually the information would be passed on to artillery units, who could triangulate the enemy's position and hit them with a well-placed barrage. As both sides realized that even far behind their lines, critical positions could be spotted and attacked by enemy artillery, they took steps to camouflage their equipment, supply lines, and troop movements. While the conditions in the trenches were certainly worse, the mortality rates of pilots were far greater than that of those on the ground. Of the 67,987 French aircraft produced during the war, 52,640 would be shot down, crashed, or damaged beyond repair. Rarely would a pilot make it out of a crash alive. There were next to no safety features in early aircraft, and parachutes were rarely used outside of dirigible crew members. By the end of the war, aviation and camera technology had advanced by leaps and bounds, forever changing the way we travel, make art, and view the world around us. And due to the sacrifice of countless pilots, the ingenuity of the foremost minds of the era, and a level of military organization the likes of which the world had never seen, the challenges of aerial reconnaissance didn't stand a chance.